So we'll talk about the community. Generally, we'll talk about the open source models, how they work. And there are three components that today we're going to talk about. And one of that is going to be the community and development. So developers, code, very essential. And we'll talk about business. So I'll start with a little bit of history of open source and how it all began. So the sharing culture has been there already. In the universities, people shared their code, and it has been always in R&D labs, even before open source began. All the research organizations, they shared their know-how. So all the code that they shared was in public domain. And what they usually did is that software is needed to keep the lights on, so it wasn't essential. Therefore, it can be shared. However, if you move in today's world, you will laugh on that, but that's how it all began. So I'll go over a bit of open source timeline, so you get an idea how it all started and where we are today. So in 70s, Emacs, I'm sure if some of you are developers, you still might be using Emacs editor. Emacs started in 1970s. One of the initial open source software that are running fine even in today's world. In 80s, GNU project started, and the GPL, the license, that came along. So if you work on several open source projects, Linux kernel, GCC itself, they are all licensed under GPL. GPL is one of the prevalent licenses that are used in open source, and its different versions are in use. We'll talk about that a little bit. Perl, X Windows, that came around in 80s. 90s, we got Linux, Python, PHP, FreeBSD, NetBSD. 2000s, LLVM, which is one of the JITs, famous JITs that is in the middle of a lot of new languages that are coming up today. All the functional programming languages, they use LLVM as backend. Firefox, one of the browsers, and Git, one of the very commonly used SCMs, Chromium browser, that came around at the same time. Android operating system that is running on almost all cell phones in the world today, barring iOS. In 2010, which is this decade, there has been some additional languages like Bootstrap, which is the Kotlin, which is a newer language that Android is using. Some foundations started coming along, Linaro, Rust, a functional programming language that started, uses LLVM as their backend. Golang, if you do web programming, nowadays Golang is actually a very commonly used language in there. So as you can see in this time graph, it started with editors, tools, moved into operating systems, started with middleware infrastructures like LLVM, applications, large-scale application frameworks, Firefox, some more tools like Git, and then it went into more high-level infrastructures like Bootstrap, for example. So as you can see, as it has been evolving, there are more and more software that has been being opened. And that also proves the fact that the open source is there to thrive, and it's really thriving as we move. So we'll go over with some of the open source business models. So it's a very commonly confused concept that free and open source, those are two different things. Free was started because there were a lot of abstractions happening where there were silos being created, a lot of proprietary software being created. Richard Stallman started with the Free Software Foundation. Open source is generally, including free software, it is about doing things in open. It necessarily doesn't mean that it's all free and open. You can still charge for the source code for the services. So that's where we're going to discuss a little bit about what are the business models that are building around open source. Support is one of the very common model. If you know Red Hat Enterprise Linux, Red Hat is one big example of support-based systems. Dual licensing. So there are several open source projects that you will see that they are dual license, which means if you want to experiment with them, try them out, they are freely available under an open source license, but if you want to do something commercial with it, then you have to go and get a commercial license. So that's a way for you to give a little bit of control so people can experiment with it. So it's more like shareware, if you will. Free data. So if you use, this is very common these days where you get free apps on app stores. So you download them. They use your data. So that's the price you pay. The data, how you interact with services is what is being then used by the provider. So that's, the data is then shared for commercial use from the customers. And a lot of companies nowadays will do that where your data is actually used to do further services into different business segments. And they are providing that data as a service. Some of them has restricted licenses, which means you could only do certain things with it. And if you have to do additional activities, maybe they will give you an opportunity to, say, use it for 100 licenses, and more than that, you have to pay for it. Open source enablement code. So this is called also tight core. So you will find the core of the software that enables it to work is open. But if you want to do additional plugins or additional services you want to build around it, those are the ones that you will basically buy for or pay for. However, these business models now are moving into yet another direction, which is so-called loose core. What that means is now the projects are becoming more mature, where they do not want to run any of these models. All development will happen in open, including the plugins. Everything is in open. So they will seek the financial support from the community. So it becomes more important for the communities to support them and thereby have a freedom to use those softwares. So for example, this is Caddy. I'm pretty sure many of you are aware of Caddy project. Recently, there is, it's actually very, very recent, there is a proposal where they want to change all proprietary licensing plugins to be open source. So it is still being discussed in the community. So I'll go over why corporates consider OSS. And this is based upon some polling that was done by Black Duck. The survey they do. In 2016, the number one reason was better quality, which is quite a surprise. But how the communities operate, that you will learn why the quality is so good. Because this is the people who want to do that. So they get together, they do their best, and they put the code out there. And it's the passion combined with talent that shows up. And that's why the quality that comes out from the community, the code, is far, far better. Features, which was the second reason. So many times people have their own niche, so they go, they implement it. So you will see that open source components, that open source, they have a lot of features that are built in there. Some of them may be good, some of them may be not mature yet, but there are a lot of features because there are so many diverse people who are working on that and trying to do different things with those softwares. Customizability. This is very important because when you adopt a piece of software, you might have yet another different kind of needs. This gives you that freedom to customize it because you have access to the source code. So you can customize it for your own use case. 99% you will use it, 1% you will customize it. 60%, 60+% companies have started to consider open source software before they consider closed source alternatives. So this is 2016. I didn't quote here, 2009 or 7, numbers were half. So it has come across from 25% to 60% within 5 to 6 years. 2017, same survey. A little bit of adjustments, but you can see that compared to 2016, 60% companies, they increased their investments or their OSS use, basically. The reason they cited was low cost, freedom to make changes. That's, again, the customizability. As you can see, it became number 2. So as you can see, various parameters, they keep shifting. But overall, you see the adoption of open source in the community has become very prevalent, from somewhere between nothing in early 2000s to almost 70% of the companies who are considering it very, very important for their business today. This is a Red Hat Enterprise OSS survey. What that tells you is how important is open source to them as a business. So as you can see, somewhat important is 10%, and 1% is not at all. Everything else is very heavy on open source. So you can easily say that 90% of them, they say that open source is very important in their line of business. Why it is? As you can see, it is very similar to the Black Duck survey because the total cost of development is low, and you have access to latest innovations because all the communities are doing a lot of work in open. Better security, which is kind of surprising because the reason is because you do it in open. There are a lot of eyes looking at the software. So therefore, there is no security by obscurity. Source code is out there. Who wants to hack your code has access to the code as well. So you develop a different mindset, how you write your software to be secure, because you know that source code will be available to everyone. And that results in a different development model that eventually ends up with a very secure software. 26% says they say high quality software, and then access to enterprise level support. That is because of companies like Red Hat or SUSE and others, IBM. So they provide a lot of good support at enterprise level around open source operating systems, primarily Linux, but also other pieces of the ecosystem. And they also have applications that the availability of a lot of applications that they can use for their business purposes. So it's a telling tale where this has now become a very critical piece of the whole business models. Open source program offices. So if you look at the companies which are consuming and producing a lot of open source, they have set up separate departments. I call them open source program offices, OSPOs, and they are like central location in a company, which is basically helping them to interact externally with different open source communities and internal communities. They act as liaisons. So some of the things they do is they leverage external projects, bring in the know-how from the communities, how they operate, what kind of policies they have, and they bring all this internally into the companies, and they educate internal developments around those. And they also help internal development teams to get on board and work with those communities and bring those software into their own businesses. They go out there, their ears and eyes are open all the time, so do not reinvent the wheel. So do not rewrite the software that's already available there, enhance it. So as you will see today, all the software, they has become plug and play. So you take bigger components, you join them together and build a solution. Developer onboarding, so they help a lot of developers to come on board, find their space, and become contributors. And they also generate goodwill for the company in all these open source communities. So if you hear about who is doing open source. A lot of companies are contributing their developer time, and they generate a lot of goodwill for them in the open source development communities by contributing to those components which are essential to their businesses, thereby keeping their business sound. So OSPOs are very common in larger corporations where they have these ears and eyes open all the time to see what projects are out there and what projects make sense, which are critical, essential to their business. And they come up with policies on supporting them, either by contributions or by other means. They also help them with compliance. So one of the things with open source is often ignored is that they do all the software, they have licenses. So, and licenses have obligations. When you use them, when you distribute it, it's a knowledge that you have to have when you utilize open source. So open source programmers, they help you with defining those policies and how you would be able to leverage it internally inside businesses. They also help you to create a culture of open source within your companies. And as I mentioned, they feed strategic projects, which are very key to your organizations. So one other thing, what OSS users value. So essentially, at this point, I will also cover a little bit of how the communities are constructed, and this is very important to understand what is required in what operating system, open source users value in an open source. So as you can see in this graph, number one is stability. So it's important for anybody who's trying to be a user that a particular piece of software is stable. So they look for parameters that defines that a software is stable. Security is very important, as you saw in the Red Hat survey as well. Security was one common reason why they chose open source. Transparency, because code you built is provided to you. So transparency is very important to the users, that there are no blobs, binary blobs, or things like that. Customizability, we talked about it, and documentation. So when you want to onboard somebody, we know that a lot of times developers, they like to code, but they don't like to document. You ask them documentation, they say, look at the code. But if you want to build a community and you want to onboard more people, it's very important to have documentation. So if you are participating in an open source community and you are a contributor, pay attention to documentation, very important. It fosters inclusion. If people are new, they don't understand, documentation is their way of entry. It's ignored, often ignored, as I say. And they do not count on few things. Lack of response. If somebody asks a question and there are no response to that, it's really bad. So it's very important from the community aspect that always respond. And respond could be, no, we do not support it, and that's fine. Negative response. So you have to be inclusive, be nice to them. Conflicts. So avoid conflicts in communications. And don't reject without any notice. So give a reason why you want to reject somebody's change or proposal or idea or anything, maybe a contribution. Rudeness is not welcome. So in order to have an inclusive community, these are very important pieces that you want to consider. Responsiveness. So if you are responsive, when question comes, set a kind of a deadline, maybe a week or something like that, but be responsive. And if you are responsive, they are not looking for an answer in next 10 minutes, but they are looking for an answer that is predictable, that will be done in a predictable manner. If you look into Linux kernel community, you will see that patches are reviewed. Maybe you will get a response in a week's time. But response you'll always get. License terms. So they do pay attention to what kind of license it is that particular piece of software is put under. So when you are contributing or starting a community and you want to start or seed a source code in there, pay attention to what kind of license terms you want to include. And inclusiveness is very important because now open source communities are worldwide. There are different cultures that are involved. So inclusiveness is very, very important because there are different understandings and different contexts that you have to be careful about. All right, so I don't know if you know of the sales funnel. So there is a contributor funnel, which is very similar to sales funnel. So users are your biggest number of people in a community. So you might have tens of thousands of users, and contributors will be in thousands, and maintainers will be very few, maybe in tens, or at max, in hundreds, in very large projects. What you want to do is to have a thriving community. You want to move the people from users into contributors and from contributors into maintainers. A constant flow of downward from there is very important for a sustainable community. So always measure, find your communities and see how it is doing in terms of these roles that are out there. So who participates in projects? It's important to identify different participants. The code, who have originally contributed the code. And then there are owners. It could be a company, it could be someone else. There are maintainers who could come later, who are onboarded but are significant contributors as well, or they are maintainers for other reasons. Users. Users are very important. They use the software. They may file tickets if there are bugs, and they may provide some documentations and stuff like that. But it's a one large number of community that you will have in a community. So sustaining it, it's very important to take care of contributors, right? So if you are going to sustain a project, contributors burn out. So you have to pay attention. They are humans. So many times people just send an email blatantly saying it doesn't work, whatever you did. Essentially, it's important to have a good conversation, even if you are reporting an issue. It's important to take care of the contributors as humans. And always be in a recruitment mode for your project. So whenever you have new users showing up, always keep that in mind that you want to onboard them. One day they might become contributors and eventually maintainers. And community over code. So somebody might be contributing code which is very, very high quality, but if it is detrimental to community, you might have to take actions where that contributor is not valued in the community. So value community over code. Document everything. Document your process, your contribution process, and your guidelines, that somebody will find it easy to start in your community. Have regular releases and document the release process so people can count on it. They can always plan their releases based on how and when you're going to release. It could be people follow different release models. Some release as often as a month, some release as often as, weeks, and some have yearly schedules. So as long as it is consistent, that is what is required. Establish clear communication channels. So how you communicate is very important. IRC, mailing lists, however you do the communication, forums, very important. Put analytics in there. Put mentorship. Very important that you measure how community is doing, how various people are onboarding. And nudge towards a helping culture. So try to avoid conflicts, mitigate issues. There are a lot of free riders, which is important, but this can basically be that you want to make them contribute or come on board, become more active. If you remember Heartbleed, which was found in OpenSSL, that kind of figured out that OpenSSL is one open source software that is maintained by one person, is used in almost everywhere in internet, and there was a bug that was found, and there was no one to fix it. So it's important to understand that an open source infrastructure you might start to depend on, and it's very brittle because it's not well supported. So it's very important to see that how a particular project is doing and show up and support it. And support individual developers if you like. There are companies like Patreon, License Zero, where you can directly donate to individual developers if you are using a project and you would like that project to keep going and support it. Or you can also use TideLift, Open Collective. These are other initiatives that are there to sustain the project and support them. And importantly, that adopt a give back culture. If you are using an open source, try to give it back to the community. So talking about a developer a little bit, you don't have to be a coder. People think that open source is all about code, but that's not really true. Event planning, like this one, this is also a contribution to open source. Design, right? So you can design somebody's website or somebody's logo. Some of that's also contribution. Documentation, very important as you saw in surveys. And help people in general. You might be just not contributing code, but you might know people. So try to make connections. Try to connect people who is looking for help. Maybe you know a particular contributor and you can introduce them. And then finally, code. If you want to, or you can, contribute with code. But if you can see in this picture, the things that are highlighted in large fonts are the ones that are important. And you will see there tutorials, documentation, docs, tests, issues. It's all around documentation. Code is seen nowhere. So how the leadership works, this might look like this. When you look at a community, you might see everybody is doing their own thing. It's chaos. And how is it moving forward? And you might be intimidated a little bit. But if you zoom a little bit, look it from far, then this is what it looks like. They're all going somewhere together. And that's the viewpoint that you will always take with you. And that's how the open source projects organically move towards a goal. So it's giving away my secrets. But anyway, so this is email from Linus in 1991, when first time he proposed Linux kernel to the open source community. And this email, he says, I'm putting up an open operating system out there. This is what it can do. And please come if you want something in there, please provide feedback. And he said that this will probably never be ported beyond a PC. How wrong he was. But anyway, that is how it all started. And today, you have Android, which is running on Linux. You have the whole back end, which is running on Linux-based servers. So how old was a youngest kernel contributor? Any guesses? You will be surprised if it comes. 4. So it was my side girl who contributed a documentation fix. She was 4 and looking at her dad's laptop when her dad was away. And she didn't like the alignments. So the fact is not how big the contribution is. The important is that there is a contribution from a 4-year-old. So you can adopt early the access that it provides you to source code, to other resources is freely available. So OSS models are going everywhere. Open hardware, that's coming. Arduino, you might have heard of it. A lot of people in schools or in universities, they are doing projects with Arduinos. Open chips that are coming, RISC-V, which is actually a new architecture where the instruction set architecture is free. So if you are into hardware and you want to design, there is possibility for you to get access to RISC-V instruction set and work around it. Open Power, which is recently signed to Linux Foundation, is another initiative. And open data. So there are projects that are building around open data. Open Energy Data Initiative, which is basically for energy, collecting all the data and sharing it across various functions. Governments. In his term, President Obama set up a commission where he wanted to see how open source models work and what can be leveraged into the governments and how they can use it. So this is a tipping point I show, and it was on a following path. And this is particularly to Linux in general. For a long time, it was following proprietary operating systems. So there were features in proprietary operating systems that were being implemented into Linux in different ways. And at a certain point, it so happened, it took over where the innovation engine started to happen on Linux. So now it is an abyss. It's a trailblazer. So all the innovations that happen on Linux. This also means that earlier you had somebody else to blame. Now you have no one to blame if something goes wrong. So more responsible programming, more responsible community behavior is required in all these open source communities. So that was all I had. Thank you very much, and hope that you will be joining various communities that you are involved in future. I'll see you on internet. Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful session. My question is more on the cost benefit. So specifically, how these projects are funded, because every project requires funding, right? And every company who is contributing requires returns out of those investments. So what is the model here?
I think what you look at it is that there are aspects strategically you look at where the value is. So I kind of skipped that slide, but I had a slide where you had a ship. So open source model is like a ship. So you build a large ship, which is more like a virtual ship, and you build a shop on top. So your investment primarily is in the shop. But you are conscious that you are standing on a ship. So if there's a hole in the ship, you go and you contribute to plug that hole. That is your investment. So that's, if you mean, that's the parallel you can draw. So you contribute as much as you can, and you know that there are others who are also using this infrastructure. Taking an example of Linux kernel, right? There are several other people who are contributing to Linux kernel as well. Now, if you kind of say, theoretically put one person who does testing on your platform, right? And provides the feedback into community saying, okay, everything is good, or there is some issues. So it's particular to your platform, but you are still contributing test results into community.
I think if I compare Oasis, it's like internet.
Yeah.
Now internet has got so many partners, service providers, and all those things, right?
Yeah.
So everybody is contributing to that ecosystem. Now it looks like to me that there is no owner in open source, and everybody is contributing, but there is no direction or kind of ownership shown here.
Yes.
So is this correct?
Yes. So so this is a very good point. So essentially, open source models are about freedom. So together you build communities, and those communities move together. So there is no need to, you define your own rules and regulations, how you interact with each other. And that this is not built upon onto you to create a culture. And this is a bottom-up approach to build your communities. And what it has proven that I was showing here is
it is quite disruptive, because whosoever is not participating, it is hitting their models, business models, revenue models, and all. So there will be a lot of resistance also onto these models, right?
Certainly. There always is. Change is always tough.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, see, look, something that thrives has some inherent value to it that it is overthrowing away. So one has to understand how you can play and not resist. Rather take an advantage of it to your own advantage. And that is where the success lies. It's not about being brittle. It's about being malleable and being more understanding of the business model and changing industry. Because eventually it's about you and your customer. What models you follow is that how your customer is going to be happy, right? And it could be a paying customer, it could be somebody else. It could be yourself. So my advice to everyone who does that is that carefully evaluate how you can adopt. That is so prevalent. There must be some goodness to it.
Thank you so much.
Okay.